That's perfect. He was just a small record store owner who went to hear a popular little local band and decided he could make them stars, big stars. They had no record deal, no real respects, no prospects, and he had no experience as a manager. But Brian Epstein convinced the Beatles to sign with him, and the rest of the story is history, of course.
I did everything that I could. Everything. Shouted from the rooftops.
Well, that was Brian Epstein's life work from the time he signed the Beatles in 1962 until his death just 5 years later, guiding the Beatles from obscurity through the cultural explosion we all refer to as Beatlemania.
Brian, in my mind, you couldn't have the flair, the panache, the wit, the intelligence that Brian had. They would just merely be money managers. Brian was far more than that. If anyone was the fifth Beatle, it was Brian.
The Beatles went into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame the third year it was open in 1986. Their legendary producer, George Martin, got in 13 years later, but there had been no such honor for Epstein until tonight, when he will be inducted along with the rest of the class of 2014. Of course, getting Epstein into the Hall of Fame has been a 15-year battle for our friend, Mr. Martin Lewis.
And I would say, you say, of course, there was no of course at all. This was such a battle for you to do.
It really was. Brian had become something of a forgotten man. I mean, as you rightly said, look, without the Beatles' music, there'd be nothing for Brian to manage. But at the point that Brian discovered and started managing the Beatles, the nucleus of John, Paul and George had been together for 5 years and got nowhere. They were just popular, a cult following in Liverpool and a bit in Hamburg. Brian was the one that gave them the presentation that opened the doors for them.
He also said to them, guys, you look too scruffy. I got to dress you up a little bit, right?
That's right, because they couldn't have got on TV in those days. They were wearing leather and jeans, and British TV would never allow a scruffy-looking group on. So he didn't change their music. He knew their music was fine, and he had George Martin to help that music along. So all he did was the presentation. But then he also did so much to bang on the doors to get them a record deal, and everyone turned them down. And he did a lot in America as well. Their record company in America, eventually, Capitol Records, had turned them down 4 times in 1963. He said, who's interested in this group? Finally, Brian came up with a brilliant idea. He went to New York and managed to get a meeting with Ed Sullivan, talked Ed Sullivan into booking them for 3 consecutive shows, even though they didn't have an American record deal. And then he went to Capitol Records and said, if I can get them on Ed Sullivan,
It'll be on the #1 show in America.
That's right. And then he got, so he did that and so much more. He was a really exceptional manager.
And he basically saw something. He himself was a kid. We're talking about somebody who was very young when he began managing them. His family was in the music store business. He wanted to be something other than that, right? And this is the road he took.
That's right. And one of the things was, in 1962, he said, in a very quiet way, because he was not a boasting, bragging type of guy, he said, the Beatles will be bigger than Elvis, which seemed ludicrous.
Shocking,
because they were from a blue-collar town, and in those days, the British record industry was very London-centric, and Liverpool was a little shabby town. But one of the things was, when I started this campaign to try and get him in the Hall of Fame, I banged on all the doors, and the attitude was, he's gone, he's a nowhere man. And I felt, well, we have to start a campaign. So we started a website, brianepstein.com, and we got over 50,000 people to sign a petition, and I kept banging on the doors.
I have a big question for you before you go. No Brian Epstein, no Beatles?
Absolutely not, because without him, they couldn't have even got out of Liverpool. They'd be playing on a cruise ship on the Mersey Road. By the way, these are the cufflinks that I wore when I was in the room with Brian Epstein.
They're beautiful.
Now, December '63, there's 1,000 other people there. It was the Beatles' Christmas show, but I wore these cufflinks in the room with Brian Epstein.
All right. The irrepressible Martin Lewis has been with us. Every time you're here, it's some other thing you're doing. But congratulations to you. You got this one done. Right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Nice going, Martin. All right, still to come. Interesting question here.
Yeah, do newborn babies, can they survive? Do they have survival skills? We have the answer.
Okay, we'll be right back.
So, they changed music, but he changed things.
That's right. That's Andrew Oldham came up with that line.
Yeah.
He said, the Beatles changed the world, Brian changed our world.